At first glance, this photograph might appear merely to be a playful self-portrait taken by Lee Miller, photojournalist, war photographer and model. But the photograph hints at something darker. See, Miller is in fact wallowing defiantly, victoriously, in the bathtub of one of history's most brutal dictators.
Lee Miller was an American photojournalist employed by Vogue. She ended up in Munich and she found Hitler's private apartment.
They wanted to be at the birthplace of the Nazism at the moment it crumbled and fell.
The image is actually taken on the very day that Hitler and his wife had both taken their lives.
The photos that we see from this shoot are fascinating.
It's the set dressing that's important. The key feature for this photograph is the boots,
which had earlier travelled through the concentration camp, Dachau.
Sherman described her going around Dachau in an ice-cold rage. She was so angry about what she was seeing that this, in a way, was a vengeance. And it's like she's metaphorically grinding her heel into his face.
This photograph is just one example of art and conflict's complex relationship.
What art allows is that time for kind of processing and contemplation.
There's always space for art to be relevant after a conflict.
War comes to people now. It doesn't seem to be on battlefields, it's more in people's everyday lives.
I think there can certainly be a shock element, which is meant to sort of jolt the public out of their complacency.
In what ways have artists depicted warfare and conflicts throughout history? And as warfare and conflicts have changed and evolved, how too has the art created alongside it? Lee Miller's photography is kind of emblematic of its time, a defiant, personal artwork that doesn't shy away from the horrors of war.
That kind of cultural worldwide trauma of 2 world wars, it really forced artists to face it head on.
As time's moved on, focus is then more on the suffering and the after effects of war and less on the heroism.
I mean, obviously Guernica is kind of like the classic example which he made in response to bombing in Spain during the Civil War.
And the visceral grief that you see in that picture, it's obviously a work that's from the heart.
So often, it is these personal, direct experiences that lead to these responses, as we see with Miller.
She was travelling throughout Europe in this period, very much sort of embedded with the troops. It's such a contrast to her earlier career. So she started off as a model, very much a kind of object of desire, featuring on the pages of Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. Lee Miller was really proud of Vogue for publishing these photographs. As you look through copies of Vogue now, it's quite a jolting juxtaposition where you'll have articles about the latest summer fashions, and then the next page there are these really quite brutal images that Miller took of the atrocities of the concentration camps.
I think today her images endure as the most extraordinarily tough and confrontational account of the horrors of that war. She took the pictures in many cases that other people did not, and she was there photographing because she wanted to show the world what had happened. And it was like taking us and banging our faces in it and saying, look at what has been allowed to happen. Understand it and never allow this to happen again.
Another artistic response to this dark hour of human history came from Benno Schotz, an influential figure in the Glasgow Jewish community who organised exhibitions of Jewish art and helped war refugees.
Benno Schotz made The Lament in 1943. Just 2 years before he made that sculpture, his sister and brother-in-law were murdered, executed in the small town that he came from in Estonia. The nude figure embodies this kind of idea of it being a kind of big existential human crisis. You can kind of see the kind of moment of grief.
A similarly direct artistic response to the Second World War came from Robert Henderson Blyth, who carried a lamp in his pack which, when fitted with a special bulb, allowed him to paint in the hours of darkness.
After he left art school, he joined the Royal Army Medical Corps. That took him to Europe, to the continent, to Holland, Belgium, Germany.
Particularly striking is this painting, a self-portrait subtitled Existence Precarious,
It's a kind of quiet painting. I think it's also a very visceral. It kind of hits you in the stomach, really, when you look at it. It's a very familiar expression. It's that 1,000-yard stare that you see in sort of later Vietnam War photography, a kind of disassociated expression on his face. The landscape is kind of destroyed by war behind him. It's really shocking. This sort of centre of civilization, as it would have been perceived at the time, could go from being a very kind of sophisticated, cultured place to being a place of conflict, deprivation, trauma. So it's really quite a powerful image.
From the same era, there's another great example of an artist defying the Nazis.
Claude Cahun and their partner Marcel Moore lived in Jersey during the Second World War, which was occupied by the Nazi forces. Whilst living there, they started basically a campaign of resistance.
Secretly handing out flyers that presented the German campaign as a losing battle, encouraging German soldiers to desert.
It was centred around a figure of a German soldier, the soldier with no name. They would tuck them into the pages of a magazine, or they'd throw them into the passing car of a Nazi officer. They were arrested by the occupying troops, who were really surprised to find that this resistance campaign had been undertaken by two middle-aged people. They were thought it was part of a much wider cell over the whole of the island.
They were sentenced to death, a fate avoided when the island was liberated in 1945.
There's this really powerful image of Claude Cahun standing in the doorway of their home at La Roqueuse in Jersey, which was taken on the day of their liberation from prison. They're biting down on a German insignia, this little image of an eagle. And it's really a gesture of defiance and survival, I think, in the face of such oppression.
Of course, in the decades since the Second World War, warfare has dramatically evolved, and alongside it, so too has the access of photographers to conflict zones and the speed at which their images can be circulated.
I mean, Don McCullin's a British photographer from a poor working class background. He seemed to fall into photography. He's a man who perhaps paradoxically likes war. He likes to cover war, but is profoundly disturbed and horrified by the things that he sees. The beauty of McCullen, I think, is his humanity, his ability to get close. You don't tend to notice the techniques. His most iconic photograph is the one of the American GI, the shell-struck GI, who's staring out at the camera. McCullen speaks of dropping to his knees to get that shot, which speaks to the kind of instinct that's at work in a documentary photographer like Don McCullin, which is why, images from war by a photographer like McCullen will endure, because they speak profoundly to the effects of war. You can see the uniformity of war sometimes in settings, particularly as it relates to a domestic setting. War that comes to a town rather than on a battlefield. You can see that reflected in some of these images of Northern Ireland. There's a very iconic image of a woman cowering in shock in a doorway as the military storm past the entrance to her home. It's that domestic setting in wars that are happening decades apart. It's tragic and heartbreaking, but you do see history repeating itself over and over again.
This kind of vicious cycle of conflict has been picked up by many artists, like Jenny Saville, whose conflict painting is infused by the imagery of war as seen in the media.
The Jenny Saville drawing is very large scale, a response to the Syrian crisis. It kind of references Renaissance Christian imagery. It represents a kind of pietà, a mother holding her child in her lap.
I had a lot of images, a lot of images of war situations, and they're so remarkably similar, whether they're Rwanda, whether they're Bosnia, whether they're Iraq, Syria, that's maybe the colour of skin and the physiology changes a little bit, but the basic impulse is the same. And we do this again and again as humans. We just blow buildings up, we kill each other, we have children that are dying in our arms, and you sort of think, oh gosh, we just repeat this cyclic pattern. And I've got 2 children, so it was actually very difficult making the work. I had to divorce myself from the feelings that I had about if they were my children, because that's quite painful to imagine. But I knew it was very powerful, I wanted to do it.
This through line of the cyclical pattern of conflict comes up again and again in visual art, as does the challenges of artists depicting such horrors. Everlyn Nicodemus's reference scroll on genocide, massacres and ethnic cleansing is a 16-metre long scroll that lists centuries of genocide around the world. Nicodemus emphasizes the limits that artists face in visually representing the terrifying extent of extreme suffering and evil. It was a 6-year labor of love. She had previously said of this work, sitting on the floor with a special needle and linen thread in hand, I slowly advanced by stitching and stitching again and again. Her intention was to make our frightening collective memories and history visibly present, asking, like so many artists, how do we prevent it from happening again? The true power of art that grapples with conflict is, ultimately, its ability to explore the otherwise unexplorable, providing an outlet for experiences, a way of working through issues.
There are obviously artists in both Ukraine and Russia who are making work in response to what's been happening in that conflict. The same in Palestine, in Israel and Gaza. You know, artists and creative people will be making responses to what's happening in real time, but also afterwards.
There will always be a power to these images, and hopefully a power to effect change.
Of course, the most profound artworks are often the most personal, and those can take years to emerge. Remember Lee Miller in The Bath? She rarely actually spoke about any of her wartime experiences.
She was suffering from something that was little understood called post-traumatic stress disorder. But in those days, there was nothing. You just put up and you shut up, and you ended up drinking a lot of alcohol.
She never revisited these images that she took of the concentration camps, and it wasn't until after her death that they were discovered by her family.
Hidden in the attic all the time was her immense stash, something like 60,000 negatives, all of her manuscripts. Discovering Lee's work was a life-changing experience. I had to re-evaluate Lee from being the useless drunk that I had known for most of her life to being this incredibly competent reporter who took the most amazingly penetrating photographs. There's that wonderful saying by Santayana, those who ignore the past are condemned to repeat it. And we have to have this knowledge so that hopefully enough of us can stand up and say, no, we're not going to go down this route anymore. Let's stop violence, let's stop killing people.